So when I think of the military and climate change, they seem like two unrelated topics. However, the climate hawks that a potential Biden administration would like to appoint to the Pentagon see things differently. How would that affect the capabilities and readiness of our military?
Well, in a weird way, if you could adopt field strategies that made you less dependent on logistical supply lines, big, heavy bulk fuel and that kind of stuff, that would actually be a good thing. But what we're seeing out of a potential Biden administration is telling the military to be more prepared for a more convoluted world, more humanitarian assistance missions, more conflict over arable land and water sources, preparing bases and installations for rising, floodwaters and more severe storms. That would think that you would need more, right? You would need more cargo equipment, more airplanes, more ships, more people to deal with this very messy world. And yet at the same time, we see calls for decreases in defense spending. So what do you want the military to do? To be combat ready and to be able to not only secure America's interests, but help our partners and allies? Or do you want them to be smaller and older and less ready because they're focused on these additional expenses of combating climate change? I mean, it's just ridiculous, really.
And if the U.S. military is stretched so thin, does that allow emergent powers such as China or even Russia to take advantage of us?
Yeah, it does. I mean, our Navy has fewer than 300 ships. When we had to deal with a global problem back in the Cold War, you had about 550. The U.S. Army had about 770,000 soldiers back during the Cold War. Today, they only have 480,000. So really, we have a military that's half, maybe two-thirds the size that it was when we were dealing with major challenges, right? China itself has 350 ships. They add the equivalent of another country's Navy to their own Navy about every 2 years. So it's really hard to imagine how our men and women in uniform are supposed to do all the things they're being told to do with reduced budgets. And yet you see, as you had mentioned, China, Iran has 3,000 ballistic missiles. Russia is investing heavily in artificial intelligence and disruptive operations in the Middle East. So it's just there's contradiction in these sort of pronouncements out of the Biden team.
And unfortunately, now for many years, we've seen China, they weaponize the whole debate around climate change to get the U.S. to commit to reducing the amount of carbon pollution that we put out into the atmosphere while they're, quietly behind the scenes ramping up their own manufacturing, their own production to try and compete with us on the economic front, trying to pass us there on that front. But when it comes down to it, we've seen Joe Biden, when he's looking at his Pentagon picks, he's decided to go with General Lloyd Austin. It's interesting that he didn't go with Michelle Flournoy because, as we know, she's recently written op-eds about this very topic we're discussing, how the Pentagon can be used to tackle climate change.
It's true that a president should be able to surround himself with a team that he or she feels best supports implementing the agenda. So really the question is, what kind of agenda would a Biden White House want to be implementing? They want to go back to the Paris Climate Accords, which, as you indicated, allows China to have all sorts of emissions and doesn't have to come into line with these reduced things for like 20 years or so. So they're playing that I'm just growing up sort of card. Meanwhile, the United States has to bear the full burden of all the climate regulations here in the United States. So if the types of people that he is selecting to fill key positions are much more, let's talk about this over tea in Paris, or much more kind of discussion forward without having a military stick, you have to wonder whether or not we're going to get any kind of progress out of North Korea and Iran and China and Russia. I mean, it's just, again, it's a contradiction between what they aspire to and where they're actually placing their priorities.